Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today. Our topic this morning is going to be what you need to know about the new requirements of NERC CIP-003-9 and how to comply with this. This is our initial part one series of a multi-series presentation webinar series. We will be discussing how to comply and what the best steps are to understand the new requirements and what's coming down the pipe. This initial webinar will just give us a high-level understanding of what to expect and what we can do to kind of start the processes for building the programs to help comply with this. We have some amazing guests with us today. Let me let them introduce themselves. I'll start with Michiko. Michiko, if you can give us a small introduction about yourself.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Michiko Sal. I've been with NAES for a little over 6 years now. I'm the NERC CIP services supervisor here. I've been in the utility business for a little over 24 years now, and I'm excited to participate in this webinar and get to speak to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Michiko, for that introduction. The next one we'll introduce here is Joe Baxter with Network Perceptions. Joe?
Hello, Joe Baxter, Network Perception. I've been in cybersecurity for over probably 25 years. Former CERC auditor, CIP auditor in the CERC region, senior CIP assurance advisor at NERC, and now the director of solutions engineering here at Network Perception.
Thank you, Joe. And last but not least, we'll have Ben.
Yes, Ben Sterling. I'm the Global Director of ICS Cybersecurity here at ABS Group. Before joining ABS, I was in the oil, gas, and utilities industry for about 15 years. I have coming up on 2 decades of cybersecurity experience.
Thank you, Ben. I appreciate that. And my name is Keon McEwen. I'll be the moderator today to help facilitate the discussion. We have some great minds on with us today, so let's get started. Initially, we'll have some webinar information to provide to you. If you have any questions for today, please place them in the questions section anytime throughout the presentation. And as they pop up, we'll see if we can answer them, or we'll save them for at the end of the presentation. We'll have a short section for questions and answers. There will also be a PDF copy of this webinar presentation, which will be available in the handout section of the GoToWebinar panel. Today's webinar is also being recorded, and that recording will be available at the following link. And please allow at least 1 to 2 business days for that recording to be posted. So let's begin by setting the stage of the industry and what we're seeing today. So this slide, this presentation shows a little bit about different organizations and what we've been seeing. 9 out of 10 organizations with OT systems have experienced some type of cyber incident in the past year. Something else to look into is 47% of organizations don't have the internal resources to manage those OT incidents. And another one is external attackers have had about a 75% success rate of penetrating OT systems. And then organizations, about 72% of them don't have the full visibility into their supply chain for their OT networks. And 80% of organizations find it difficult to stop cyber attacks in time. Also, 65% of organizations have limited visibility of their OT networks, and 56% of organizations have IT teams that are tasked with monitoring the OT networks. And also, there are about 45 organizations that OT systems are at high risk. So this just sets the stage of where our OT environments are currently and what's driving the need for requirement changes to come about. So I'm going to toss it over to Ben here to help explain a few of the cyber incidents that we've seen in critical infrastructure in the past few years. Ben, can you go ahead and highlight some of the ones that are mentioned here?
Yeah, sure. So we're all familiar with some of the incidents, but 3 I'd really like to highlight that I think highlight some of the issues we'll be talking about today. Starting in 2021, Colonial Pipeline, mixed trust environment, impact to operations really over visibility and where their lines were delineated and where they weren't. Then you come out with last year and Pipe Dream being you know, all about the code-assist library. So if anyone is sitting there thinking, oh, well, I don't have the PLCs that were listed. Well, realistically, you know, the code-assist library is used by a lot of manufacturers. So we have to look at that as a serious threat across the supply chain base. And then here this year, here in February, we have reports of malware, granted not ICS specific malware, but still malware making it to the ICS environment of a US based energy company. So this is a pretty alarming trend here over the last 3 years. You know, Michiko and Joe, what have you all been seeing in this space?
Go ahead, Joe.
Well, with a lot of these types of attacks and things like that, you see that generally when we come to it from the network perception perspective, we see it as people struggling after an attack, struggling to, you know, really enforce or to demonstrate that they had segmentation, you know, actually understand their firewalling rules and the things that would have prevented in the first place. So we see a lot of it on the backside when these attacks, after these attacks have come, but usually people struggling to fix the problem or remediate.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. So
I was going to say from my end, what
go ahead,
what I see is a lot of folks that really don't know what they have to protect. So especially on the low impact side of things, medium and high, you know, the requirement to have a full BCA inventory is already established. But for low, it's called out that a discrete list is not required. And unfortunately, because it takes a lot of work to create a full inventory, a lot of folks don't go through the effort. And by not knowing precisely what they have and where they have it and how it's protected, it makes it even more difficult to know if their containment efforts are really effective or not. So that's what I'm seeing.
You know, it's funny, you both bring up the same point, and this is something I learned many years ago. Actually, I won't say it was the first time I learned this, but I was involved. I went in an incident response where we had been given network maps, and we were trying to trace something down. And the network maps were accurate enough, but they just weren't complete. You know, there were systems dropped off, systems not there, connections not mapped out. Everything that was on the map was correct, but there were. It's kind of the difference between accurate and complete, right? And that being an important thing.
Absolutely, Ben. I've definitely seen a need to have a robust management of change system to help identify those changes and actually record them properly. So that's definitely something we've seen in the
Well, and keep them up to date, yeah. And one quick thing, I see a question came in, what is an ICS environment? The industrial control systems. So anything from the computers aboard ship would be an ICS environment to, you know, computers running a power plant or factory, refinery, petrochem, even down to the SCADA systems for the pipelines.
Thank you, Ben, for that. And I guess, Michiko, we'll get into next. Can you give us a little overview of the requirement that's coming down?
Yeah, and we'll hit it again a little further down in this presentation, but just a little background for everyone. Project 2020-03, the supply chain low impact revisions, you know, was really the next logical step after they got CIP-003 published for medium high impact BCSs. NERC recognized fairly quickly that you know, that there was a whole group of low impact BCS owners that weren't required to adhere to CIP-003, and as a result, they said we got to do something with low impact. So they did a study. The final report is highlighted here, the supply chain risk assessment, which will be available in the handout section of this presentation. But essentially said, hey, we need to do something about how to protect low impact. So they would really focused in on the the supply chain attack vector and what could low impact BCS owners do to protect themselves. So that is the evolution of CIP-003-9. We'll get into what the actual requirements are a little later, but essentially a supply chain attack that targets a trusted third-party vendor who offers services or software vital to the supply chain. That's essentially what the application is right now that we're trying. I mean, that's the CIP-13 premise of trying to protect high and medium. Now we're giving a soft start to low impact on what they can do to also protect themselves from supply chain attacks. And this is again, this is supply chain protections light, as I'd like to put it. It's not the full menu requirement of CIP-13 on low impact. It's just a slow start, but that's what this is all about.
So Michiko, do you feel like this is going to be increasing as time goes by?
I do. I believe that, like I said, this is the first step. It's going. I believe that when you look at the landscape of the grid, you know, we're so focused on the large generator transmission operators, but when you aggregate the impact of all the low impact BCSs, it is tremendous. Yeah, I hear a lot of folks say, yeah, I'm only a couple hundred megawatts of impact, or, you know, if I fell off the grid, no one would even know. I'm just a blip on the radar. Individually, maybe, yes, but in aggregate, no. There's a tremendous amount of influence low impact BCS owners have on the grid in aggregate. So this is just the first step.
Well, and
yeah, go ahead.
If I may, Michiko, coming from Texas and having lived through Uri, I can tell you that grid conditions matter on that, right? Because yeah, we may have, you know, thousands of megawatts of spinning reserve at any given time, and that's fine and that's great until you get into a situation where you don't, and then every few megawatts really starts to matter. So I think NERC is definitely looking at this. I think as we watch the history of how CIP has evolved, it's very clear that, you know, we're not done with this by any stretch of the imagination. And I think what's really, unfortunately, driving some of FERC's orders and the way they're going is because, while I think the compliance requirements are, you know, what we have is people trying to comply versus trying to be secure. They're hitting one target but not the other, and I think that's what is continuing the evolution of these regulations, at least especially from what I'm hearing from the Biden admin and what they're wanting to do on their cybersecurity directives for the nation. So
yeah, I'm sure that there's more coming, and not just in association with supply chain risk, but with other compliance regulations that are good for medium and high. I think that they're going to find that they are really applicable to low impact owners as well, and we're going to see those coming in the next few years.
All right, thank you. Ben, I have a topic for you here that we're going to get into next about what this looks like in an environment. Can you kind of highlight some information on that?
yeah, so one of the things I want to highlight, especially around CIP-003-9, is because it's focused on vendor remote access and basically preventing attacks like what happened to Target a few years back. One of the things I want people to consider is, if you have your DCS or term control vendor doing remote tuning, remote access, if they have a connection into your environment, it very well may be bypassing a lot of your intended security controls. It's bypassing your enterprise security controls, probably even your plant firewall, and is connected directly into your control system network. Now, there are a couple things here. One, from a cybersecurity standpoint, if you don't control the router or firewall that they're using to make that connection, how can you ensure the quality of the rules and making sure that they can only do what you think they can do. And then from a compliance standpoint, one of the things I really want to toss up to Michiko and Joe is make sure we understand the limits of risk transfer, right? The way the way CIP is written, throughout CIP, there's, the phrase, the responsible entity shall. And it really limits the ability of entities to transfer risk. And not only that, if, Michiko and Joe, have y'all had any experience where you're going through an audit and trying to get the configuration of that device from a vendor can sometimes be pretty difficult during a RFI period?
Oh, absolutely. We run across that all the time. Especially when we allow the OEMs to control the firewalls, to control the electronic access control points to the BCS. It's extremely difficult, and sometimes they view those configurations as being proprietary, so they're unwilling to share the raw running config files for those particular devices. So we advocate that that everyone control their own destiny, their compliance destiny, be in control of your electronic access control devices, own those, manage those so that you truly are controlling the access point and that you're not reliant on a third party to do that on your behalf. And that way you're always audit ready, you're in full control of your compliance evidence, and you also should be fully aware of who you're allowing in and out of your systems and what exactly is being permitted to be communicated with.
Quick little story in support
it-
of this. A couple of years ago, I was on an audit, very large entity, had a great system. Everything was virtualized. It was on all of the PCs, ran PC over IP from a SAN. It was fantastic, high end. Everything was done excellently. But to that SAN, which is an EMC SAN, if I remember right, they had a back channel that was set up by a different group in the organization. Basically a T1 connection directly into the back of that SAN, and the company would come in and do performance testing and look for back problems with the SAN every month or something like that with their technicians all over the world. And that really had no control whatsoever, and a stray, whether accidental or whether on purpose, just a few mouse clicks could have wiped out their entire EMS because they could have just basically destroyed the LUNs on the SAN, and it would have wiped out their entire system. And that was the type of vendor access and monitoring and tuning that Ben talked about just a moment ago that nobody was paying attention to.
Mm-hmm. This, having been in the power industry for a while, it's pretty common for turbine control vendors especially to want to come in and do remote tuning and maximize the life of that turbine. And one of the things that I found pretty interesting in a former life at a utility was when we forced the vendor to come through a separate remote access channel. Okay, we're killing this network connection you have as what we saw as a back door. We're no longer going to allow you to connect directly into our control systems. You're going to come through a managed remote access. And Keon, I think you can go to the next slide on this one. When you come through this managed remote access, we are going to monitor what you're doing. We're going to have screen grabs of what you're doing. We're going to know when you're coming into the plant. In fact, we're going to make you call the control room for second factor authentication anytime you're coming into the plant. One of the things our plant managers, and I don't know if Michiko and Joe, you can back me up on this, got a real sense of was, holy crap, I had no idea that the vendors were going to be in my systems this much, right? So as soon as they started picking up the phone to call the control room, it opened everyone's eyes to how often those connections are actually made.
For most of the plants, at least at NERC and our fleet, I think a majority are doing exactly that, going through the control room. They're having the phone calls, making the arrangements with the OEMs to come on in and do the remote tuning and instrumentation. I don't know about the frequency. I know that there are times of the year where it's more often than not, especially if there's a lot of troubleshooting that needs to happen. But generally, I'd say the scary part for me is not just the the frequency, but the amount of unfettered control that that a third-party vendor with remote access may have. You know, depending on what ports and services are being allowed, they can not only come into the BCS and make changes there, but they can actually change the firewall config. They can open up and they can open up channels that, and you would never be aware of it unless you were doing some type of monitoring of the EAP itself. So that's a little scary. It is going to be one of the issues that we're going to have with CIP-003-9 is being able to monitor the monitor, you know, in which case, if you're fully reliant on a third party OEM to provide this service, you know, what keeps them in check? A good management. Yeah. Go ahead.
And to that point, you know, quite a few plants don't just have one OEM. You know, sometimes your balanced plant DCS is totally different than your turbine controls. Occasionally it's, you know, a unified system, but more often than not, it tends to be different vendors. And you're almost guaranteed to have a one-off PLC somewhere on a skid. So, you know, I think a plant by plant solution is always going to struggle to comply. And I think that's why pulling together something where you have the ability to cut off individual vendors and, you know, you could say, oh, okay, I've got a remote access firewall rule. All my vendor remote access comes through here. Well, that may also include some monitoring that you need. And without a real discrete ability to judge who's coming in and out, I struggle with how you're going to actually operationalize that.
There's a question that came in from the chat I'd just like to address really quickly because I said it. SAN is a storage area network. It's basically a large disk array, a redundant disk array. So I just wanted to drop that in there.
No, thanks, Joe. And I kind of want to get into maybe some information that you can provide as far as gaining the visibility into these type of situations that we're discussing.
Well, when we look at CIP-3 particularly, I tend to break things down into what I call processes, and this is one of the things that I've been using to instruct and teach and consult with for a couple of decades now. The idea of writing a process, and the process must be it's a unified process. It's a single process that an organization does that when you follow a procedure that's written against a process that is documented, you will then create evidence. And every time you pass a question in the process, you create an artifact. Well, the idea of what I've got here on the screen is that, you know, if you follow the CIP standards, you put them all together, you know, you've got the prerequisites that come from your CIP-2 assessment. That's how you get the lows. That's how you get the mediums. That's how you get the highs. You have to have an understanding of that, because if you don't understand what your situation is, you can't control it. If you don't have a good inventory, you don't know what to control. If you don't understand your networking paths, you don't know how to control. There's a bunch of things in there in the prerequisites. You have to have a process for that. That should be handled by CIP-2. But as you move into CIP-3, section 3, that adds, of course, to the orange, yellow, and darker blue box up at the top, that creates these processes. Well, how do you find out? You know, you've got a deny by default rule. Well, that's very important, but how do you verify that? What's your evidence of that? Because when the audit comes, they're going to say, please demonstrate from your evidence how you have denied by default rules. Same thing with justified routable connectivity outside of that asset boundary, for lack of a better term. And then you can take out the time sensitive stuff. But now section 6 of CIP-3 wraps all of that up with this whole new concept called vendor access control. Now, in a lot of ways, vendor access control, I think, is kind of more of the same. You've got to control access, you've got to monitor and control electronic communications, and this is just more of it, a different thing that's really not so different, just a different category. But by looking at this into the process perspective, you've got the ability to kind of put a name to something. And when you can put a name on it and write a process for it, it's a lot easier for you to visualize and actually understand whether or not you're getting the evidence you need on the other side.
Well, and you know, Joe, one of the things I like about your slide here, and I think is very important in any compliance program, that's effective is to be efficient. Compliance for compliance sake can create its own problems. One of the things that having effective controls can actually do is not only make you compliant but secure. So driving to having a inventory, while it's not required by CIP, from a cybersecurity standpoint, you can't protect what you don't know. So
exactly.
Yeah, a list is not required. That's not a compliance requirement, but it is a security requirement. And I want to make sure everyone in the audience keeps those two things separate, because you can be compliant and insecure. Going back to the firewall rule comment and what you're talking about here with Section 6 of CIP-003, I can lump everything into one, but that doesn't give me very fine-grained controls around it.
Right.
No, go ahead, Joe. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
I was just going to say that I've often told people that really when I first got into when I left the banking world, the financial sector, came to electrical in 2008. One of the knocks that people commonly had against the CIP standards, is they're so lightweight. They're just not good security standards. And I've come to the place where I've realized that the beauty, if you will, it's an ugly beauty, but it's a beauty of the CIP standards is that, yeah, they are maybe an inch deep, but they're a mile wide. And the idea of them is that they are comprehensive. I mean, it's no fun to change passwords, but the thing with it's much more fun to buy a really high-end firewall. But the idea is the CIP standards force a moderate level of security across everything, across a wide range, rather than just trying to pick and choose. And this low impact stuff that's been brought in with the new Section 6, this is just a ratcheting up of that. It's not always fun. Sometimes it's hard work, but I would argue that the comprehensive standpoint of moderate security is better than having a few highs and lows, or having a peak of really something really focused on, like a really good firewall, and then nothing else. Maybe I didn't say that right, but that's the idea.
I appreciate that.
And I actually agree with that to a large extent. And I would back you up in saying that as I've moved, beyond the electric industry and really looked at the rest of the industry, as it were, I'm shocked at the programs that I see in, oil and gas and areas that haven't had the regulations of CIP. And I think to your point, yeah, the CIP standards have not been that prescriptive, but in general, that's been a good thing because it's allowed companies to comply while innovating, and the ones that are really interested in being secure, going above and beyond the standards to really build out programs that are far and away. The electric industry is leading the way. There's no doubt. In the ICS space, the electric industry is leading the way from a security standpoint.
Yep. Avoiding the hard and crunchy outside with the soft and gooey centers.
Well, Mitchell, can you kind of give us some information on the requirement that's coming down?
Yeah. And I just wanted to also say, I totally agree with what was just mentioned by both Ben and Joe here about being NERC CIP compliant doesn't necessarily equate to cybersecurity, at the highest levels, and even sometimes even at the lowest levels. Low impact now finally being pulled more into the fray. It wasn't until January 1st of 2020 when the electronic access controls became measurable for low impact. And in my personal opinion, it came in a little late, a lot late, really. It's painful. We know it's painful for folks to retrofit some of these security controls, software appliances, what have you. But it really is necessary because, as you're well aware, the grid is under attack. Our infrastructure and is being highlighted. It seems like daily. We used to get, the periodic notifications from EISAC. I'm getting frequent notifications daily throughout the entire day, every day, on all different types of attacks. So here we're catching up. We're getting caught up with a little bit more of our medium and high impact counterparts through CIP-003-9. So effectively, the new standard, which is a new section 6 or attachment 1, which requires vendor electronic remote access security controls, that becomes measurable on April 1st of 2026. FERC made the adoption last month. So first day after the first calendar quarter with a 36-month implementation plan. So there's a little bit of time, but we don't want people to think that they've got, oh, I've got full 3 years, so I don't need to think about it. No, you need to start thinking about it now and budgeting for it now, because more than likely, you probably don't have the necessary appliances or software that will allow you to monitor your OT systems, your BCSs thoroughly, and you're going to have that ability to detect, to determine when you have vendor electronic remote access, 6.1, 6.2, you're going to have a mechanism, a method, one or more, to disable vendor electronic remote access. And I believe it was Ben that was just saying, you may have several different OT processes that, one for remote tuning and instrumentation, another for health monitoring, maybe another for just another disparate vendor access, OEM access. And do you unplug from the world, or do you try to control who needs to maintain access because you need that monitoring? That's another discussion regarding how we might want to segment your systems, your networks. And then the 6.3, this is probably the most difficult portion, and that is you need to have one or more methods for detecting known or suspected inbound and outbound malicious comms for vendor electronic remote access. That detection, it's one thing to say you need to be able to detect. It's another thing to think about, well, what's next? Well, it would be response. If you detect some malicious code, malicious comms, you better be prepared to respond to that. So it's not spelled out here, but that's kind of a given. Fellas?
Well, and Michiko, on that.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Just on that, if you're reliant solely on firewall rules and you're passing vendor traffic through, and they're using any sort of encryption wrapper, how would you ever know? So I would really encourage entities to use this next 3 years to look at comprehensive remote access solutions. Get your vendors, and this is something I've been preaching for almost a decade now to the industry, is we have to stop relying on our vendors for cybersecurity. The entity should define the cybersecurity suite that they want, that suits their business needs, and go to their vendors and say, okay, Mr. DCS, I don't want your antivirus. I don't want your monitoring. I don't want your piecemeal solution. Here's my stack of tools that we have built out. I want you to allow us to use this, and I don't want to hear anything about we haven't tested it, we haven't validated it. Well, let's work together, let's get this done, and let's put in place the tools that my company needs to be secure. Because at the end of the day, and one of the anecdotes I would share here is, who remembers the name of the HVAC vendor in the Target attack? No one. It was Target that was attacked. It came through the HVAC vendor. It was the failure of the HVAC vendor cybersecurity and on Target to not segment out their payment network. But Target is who we blame. So there's risk that you cannot transfer there.
Many of the responsible entities have more than one low impact BCS. So you may have 3 different OEMs all competing to give you this security suite, and it's not going to come inexpensively, and it's going to be one-offs because they only look at their own their own systems. They're not worried about the guy next to you. And technically, they're not responsible for knowing the network interconnections and how the DCSs talk to each other, or how the control systems or BCSs talk to each other. That's not their responsibility. That's the responsible entity's responsibility, and ultimately they're the ones that are holding the compliance bag.
Absolutely. And Joe, can you get into, sorry to cut you off there, but Joe, can you get into some of the building blocks that's necessary for this type of visibility?
Sure, I'd be glad to. We call that the two sides of network visibility. Oftentimes I'll use the phrase past, present, and possible. Most people have some type of facility in their network, maybe not. Sometimes in low impacts, you don't have all of this, but many times people will have some type of management facility or even a logging facility in their network where they can see through the ability of a tap or a span port, or by syslog, or using a dredger like Splunk or something like that, to be able to find out what has happened on the network. Or they will have the ability with IDS, IPS, or their management system to be able to see what is happening on the network, capturing packets, things like that. But the problem is that if two machines, if two hosts, if host A and host B across a firewall have never attempted to communicate or never communicated, you wouldn't know whether or not they could. So we we encourage people to have a plan to find the other side of that network visibility, which is the modeling, the access modeling, to tell you what can talk one to another, to have that full list of available paths based upon your networking configuration, your firewall filters and rules. When you have that full network model, then you know what could happen. You don't know, I mean, you can tell whether or not System A and System B can talk, whereas usually with traditional methods, just the traffic monitoring, you only see if System A and System B have talked.
To back that up, Joe, I remember one incident where I was walking down a power plant. We had just finished some meetings with plant personnel talking about some of the security solutions we were going to put in place. And we had a pretty good monitoring setup going and seeing what was coming on and off the network. But I walked past a water treatment trailer that they had brought in while they were rebuilding and upgrading their water demineralization system. And I saw an antenna sticking out of this trailer. And I walk in, and sure enough, there's a display, an HMI sitting there that happened to be Windows XP embedded and no firewall enabled and not patched, and plugged into the back of it was a cell modem. And this was patched into the control system network. So we were aware that that was there, but you have to go even to that endpoint and look and see, is there another connection on the backside, right? You have to holistically make sure that these third parties, these vendors, aren't bringing things in. And not even just from a monitoring standpoint, but a programmatic standpoint of making sure language is in contracts about what is acceptable and not acceptable access. Again, that won't protect you from stupid and someone doing something. You have to do what you're suggesting, is not only look at what is talking, but what can talk and what the actual endpoints are.
Exactly. I knew where you were going with that. I've done many walk downs myself in plants, and you're finding wireless access points everywhere, and you've got to figure out, okay, is this connected to the control system, or is this some vendor who's just watching Netflix on his phone? You've got to figure out where those things are connected to, and without that model, you don't know where your potential access points are, where the potential vulnerabilities are.
Yeah, and this brings the key information as far as building that resiliency to your networks and to your operations. So Joe, can you also give us some insight on how do you show the evidence as far as your network segmentation and some of the other things we might have to show in the future?
Sure. This is one of the things as an auditor throughout 2013 through 2015, and then on as I think I probably observed maybe 500 CIP audits in my life overall over the years. all over North America. And the thing that I tell people is that I feel like people maybe didn't quite get it first is that you have to show your work. It's just like your algebra teacher in junior high. You didn't do the problem if you didn't show your work. And so you can't just talk about segmentation. You have to have a plan. You have to have some ability to demonstrate, again, create evidence, because that's what that's what I ask, that's what auditors are trained to ask, is please demonstrate from your evidence your disaggregation, your network segmentation, whatever the case may be. Particularly in the low impact, you're trying to disaggregate the low impact systems to make sure that they can't be bumped up into the medium range for more compliance requirements. Perfect case of that. How do you show that? How do you demonstrate that? How do you know? And again, that comes back to that access control modeling, that access communications modeling, to be able to say, all right, I can show my segmentation because I know through my model that these two systems do not have a single point of failure, do not have a single communication point.
We have another comment in our chat box as well. Keon, do you see that?
Yep, I was going to highlight that after we spoke about this, but we can talk about it now. The comment came in, said CIP-003-9 says low impact BES is not required to have a list of authorized users, including remote access users, but they are required to have a way to detect suspected malicious remote access. Michiko, can you give a little insight into that?
Yeah, actually, this kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier about low impact doesn't have the same requirements as medium and high, obviously, but we think that it's going to get there with time. And one of the things that I believe is going to happen is that you're going to have some type of access management control, and that dovetails right into this statement here. You not only need to know what you need to protect, but you also need to know who is authorized to be in your system, physically or electronically. You need to know that information so you can control those communications. And in addition, and this is a little segue, we were talking about, well, what do we think might be happening next? Well, I really think that the next logical place to go is to require that low impact has the antivirus, similar to what's under CIP-7 requirement 2 for medium and high impact, that will be applicable to low impact as well. But again, you have to be able to demonstrate, show, this is how we control and protect our networks. These are the mechanisms that are in place to ensure that we have proper segmentation and that we're measuring and monitoring at the appropriate places.
Well, and Michiko, with this comment, one of the things I'd like to point out is this is again where you can be compliant but not secure.
Right.
There's no requirement to tag authentication with your PACS system, for example, which is physical access control. But it's a damn good idea, because if I see someone badging in at one plant, yet I see them logging their credentials being used to log in at another, that might be something I want to look at. There are many ways where, yes, the CIP standards fall short, and yes, people can comply and not be secure. And I don't think any of us are advocating that's the gold standard or where we want to be. From my standpoint, I would really encourage everyone to really look at access control, not just from a remote access standpoint, but I'd bet most of the INC personnel across the nation use the same username and password to log into the engineering workstation. And just from a change management standpoint and a reliability standpoint, you don't know who made what change. You don't have that change tracking. So there are many ways where security and operations can come together. And I think that's a good dovetail into this slide, actually.
Yeah, I agree with you, Ben. I think the three things that we're trying to discuss here kind of sums up in this slide as far as what we're asking and what we're looking for industries to do. That control, you should be in control of your own compliance, your own regulations. You should be taking that as a high priority to ensure that your systems are protected the way you see they need to be protected. Can you speak a little bit more about that and why that's important?
Yeah. So with any cybersecurity program, I think everyone can agree you first have to kind of get a handle on the problem, and that starts with an inventory. And then you need to start addressing your most needed controls, and likely, especially in lows and programs that have been around, or they're just checking the boxes and haven't really dug into the red meat of what it means to be secure. You're going to have to tighten up your perimeter. You're going to have firewall rules that are not written in a great way, or maybe legacy rules still in place that, hey, we don't use that vendor anymore. Start there, start with the visibility, start adding in security. And again, it's that, it's that build, grow, run model of continuous improvement, and it's always going to feed back in and on itself. Joe, if you want to talk to that some too.
Yeah, another thing that I've been, like you said, you've been preaching for years. I feel like I hit some of the same notes as well. The idea of a maturing process. One of the things that I think that we miss oftentimes in compliance is that just because there's standards and regulations, which is true for many critical infrastructures, critical industries and infrastructures, that just because there's regulations and just because there's rules doesn't mean that we can't get better. As one of the auditors used to say in CIRC, we reserve the right to get smarter. Go ahead and reserve the right to get smarter. Go ahead and reserve the right to get better.
Like
just because there's rules that are written doesn't mean you can't get better at doing it, becoming more efficient, more effective. Having a process that matures over time, learns from the downsides, prepares for the human error instead of being surprised for it. That's really what we're talking about here.
Yeah, I definitely agree that I think the rules and regulations that we have to comply with should be a baseline. It should be something that we could baseline to, but it should not be the end all be all. It should definitely be a growing process. I mean, if you're struggling, you don't know what to do and how to do it, you can turn to those requirements and those regulations to help you come up with the right ideas. But that should not be where you stop. You should continue on.
Exactly.
So, Michiko, can you let us? Go ahead.
No, I was let Michiko chime in.
Oh, go ahead, Karen. What were you going to ask?
I was going to ask you, can you give me a little insight about the security side of this governance, being prepared for the ever-changing attack surface? How does that evolving attack surface play into compliance, and how that grows and propagates?
Oh, well, I think the guys had hit it. It's not a once and done. It's a constant evolution as our our threat vectors change. We have to adapt and be prepared to address those. And we're usually in that reactionary standpoint. We're always in the position of mitigating and responding and reacting to something that's occurred. Where I think we're evolving to is we're trying to take a proactive approach at protection, and trying to mitigate before it actually happens. Trying to maybe not mitigate's not the right word, but trying to cut it off before it actually occurs within our environments. And the first step is really knowing what you have. I totally agree. You need to know what you have in order to protect it, and then that constant adaptation to monitoring, improving, tightening the belt, so to speak, to ensure that you're not leaving any potential threat vectors open for exploit. We try to tighten that up, and I'm just reiterating what's been said over the last half hour.
And I think tightening the belt, as you put it, is always important, because when you're in incident response mode, the last thing you want to do is be struggling to find information you need. So, hey, I just saw a domain controller replicate. Okay, well, was it a domain controller? I don't know. We don't have a list of our domain controllers in our environment. Okay, that's a problem, right? So starting out with the basics, learning your system, learning what's there, what is available to be used both for you and against you. I think you nailed it, Michiko, that you have to know what the attack surface is. You have to, as cheesy as that sometimes sounds, you have to know where your problems are and be very honest with yourself about it. Think like an attacker in order to even begin securing your environment the way you need to.
And, I think, we're talking about what we can do, but, it comes right down to it. This all costs money. This is, our managers are going to have to make a decision as to what their risk tolerance is going to be. How much can they allocate to defending their systems? What do they want to put in the budget for this year, for next year? There should really be a 5-year plan in place where people are really looking hard at their own systems and evaluating what is critical, what needs to be done now. You have your measure for compliance, but again, there's a difference between compliance and security, and you may be able to get some security deployment now that's going to also address the measurable in 2026. I wouldn't wait. I would encourage people to go through this process now. Get prepared now.
Well, that brings us to a good
Yeah.
Go ahead, Ben.
Well, I just to add on to that, you have the ability to say, hey, we need these dollars and it's going to take us a while to deploy. So you use that as leverage and ability to gain security today. There's no need to wait from now till 2026. And one of the things I would also point out is a lot of the lows haven't been through audit. So, as these controls continue to expand, expect the scope of audits to not only increase, but to expand.
Well, when was the last time you had a cybersecurity project come in faster than you expected?
Exactly.
Well, we're going to open it up to a few questions here. I know we have one from the audience already, from Charles, and I'll ask this question, and whoever wants to take a swing at it, please jump in. So the question is, if you outsource the operations of a low-impact asset to a contracted vendor to operate, is all access to the low-impact asset from the vendor considered vendor electronic access?
I would say yes.
So, well, so this is from a asset owner standpoint, I'm guessing, not. So this is right up your wheelhouse, Michiko, because if it's an asset owner and then you've got a generation operator, I guess what he's asking is that generation operator a vendor remote access?
With the generation owner and generation operator, even though there could be two different registrations, that one kind of blurs the line a bit. I'm thinking more in terms of if you have a third party vendor that you contract with to do the monitoring, would they be considered, would their access be considered vendor remote access? And perhaps, let me see here. I'm trying to read the chat to make sure I'm reading that correctly. And anyone can chime in as I'm catching up.
Well, I can step in and say it this way. In the NERC functional model, all the roles, there has to be a registration, and under each registration, whether it's joint or whether you're sharing it as a GOP, somebody, one of those two registrations will have to be responsible for all of the requirements of not just the 693 standards, but also the 706 CIP standards. Somebody has to be responsible for those requirements. Now, if it's truly a vendor, which I don't know if you followed any of the epic debates in the standards drafting teams of what a vendor is, because that's part of this question. I mean, it was ridiculous. It went round and around for probably years, to be honest with you, where they just retrod the same ground over and over again. That's a very difficult question. Take a very conservative approach to all of that every time, and you'll probably win the day. But if it's not a registered entity, then they would be an external entity. Whether you call that a vendor or not, if that fits your definition or fits the standard definition, I don't know in every case. But if it's not one of the registrations or one of those roles in the NERC functional model, then it would be an external entity and it must be treated appropriately from that standpoint.
Thanks, Joe.
You know, Joe and Michiko, on that, just a quick side note. One of the companies I was working for, we were building out a battery project and we were taking bids and looking at different vendors. And one particular vendor had the ability to have control and monitoring and basically a SCADA system across all the batteries they were deploying. Now, most of their deployments at the time had only been on the distribution network. They were not NERC regulated at that time, but we were going to potentially be one of the first, actual transmission side regulated entity battery deployments for them. And I immediately asked them if they were a registered entity or not, because they had the ability to potentially impact generation. And of course they were not. So it was a interesting and short-lived business model for them. But you definitely have to be on your toes looking out for those individuals.
Well, we have another question from Garrett. When it comes to the accumulated risk of low impact BAS as it pertains to supply chain risk, has anyone suggested voluntarily non-public sharing of common third-party dependencies to help identify the risk of multiple BAS relying on the same third-party vendor? Is the risk of non-public sharing of vendors greater than not knowing the cross BAS accumulated risk?
You know, I think of, when I think of data sharing, I think of like EISAC and the socialization of all sorts of data points. And I guess there's a balance there, right? In terms of, well, how much is too much oversharing, and where does this information go? EISAC tries to make the contributions anonymous, and up until the point where we're talking about CVEs. We're talking about CVEs, and we're obviously having to give the detail on how to remediate. You're going to specifics as to which device, which firmware, what's actually going on. But I do think that we have to be careful in the balancing of the voluntary non-public sharing, because ultimately that information, once it's distributed, it's, regardless of the intent, it will go public, and you don't want it to go to the wrong areas, right?
And that was the failure of the CRISPR program, right? So the government very much tried to get some of that information together, but the fear from the industry and why we saw such a lackluster participation was, with the government doing it, it has definitely opened up to freedom of information requests and things like that. And because it was a voluntary thing, it was definitely something that wasn't going to be passed through the lawyers readily or easily. We do see programs like Ethos and Neighborhood Keeper coming out with more information sharing from the industry and third-party standpoint that I think are good steps towards that, but they don't quite answer the question that you're bringing up there. So
I think we have time for one more question. We have one from Abe. It says, is there an appetite to create on-site technical positions to facilitate network cybersecurity implementation to better bridge the gap between the control system technician, to better bridge the control system technician's needs to security needs?
I think that I think there's an appetite there. It's just what the responsible entities risk posture and their budget tolerance is. That's what really feeds that, in my mind at least.
And I agree. And where it really comes down to is the entity a regulated entity where they can pass that cost on to the rate base, or is it an unregulated market where it's a competitive market? What I would say is, in my former life, I had both. I had people specifically stationed at specific power plants based off of that power plant's contribution to EBITDA justified it. Or what we had was regions where we broke the team up into regions across the country, and everybody had their plants that they were responsible for. I definitely encourage at least that second model, if not the first, because what it does is it gets everyone very familiar with the plant, and the plant familiar with the security team. You start working together versus, you know, hi, I'm from corporate, I'm here to help. It's almost as bad as being from the government. You know, if you are not embedded in with your controls engineers, with your INC personnel, you're making a mistake. You, from a security and compliance standpoint, have to have those people on board. They need to understand what you're doing and be part of it.
Yeah, and you have to be working off the same playbook, you know, especially when it comes to cybersecurity incident response. You know, it's very hard to work siloed and to be effective.
All right, well, I'm going to make sure I do a little bit of housekeeping, and I have one more question for you, for the panelists, before we leave. So I want to make sure everybody knew that for this webinar, you can definitely get the presentation that we presented today at the link, along with a couple handouts that we provided, and just allow 1 to 2 business days for the recording to be available. Past that, let's ask this other question that just came in. He would be interested in comments on current practices already implemented that would seem to comply these new regulations. For example, external communication channel with physical disconnect switches that alarmed when enabled, switch open unless specific request received and acknowledged as legitimate.
Yeah. So some of this is some vendors have put in key switched firewalls and things like that, where there's a key switch that controls the power to the firewall. And some of those vendors have tied that into the panel alarm system so that the operator is aware when that is enabled. And, you know, that is a method. What I would say is you still typically, in the situations I've seen this, don't have access to that firewall, which means your monitoring of the connections to that firewall is at best hobbled. Even if you're taking a tap right off of where it connects into the control system, you only have visibility of the internal traffic, not necessarily what all is hitting the external side of that firewall. It's better than nothing, but I would not consider that ideal. In fact, I ripped them out of every power plant I could over the last over a few years. So again, it's not ideal. And one of the situations I saw a lot is, even if you have that going to your panel alarm system, operators tend to suppress that alarm over time because they get tired of seeing it.
And not only that, but you're also at the mercy of the configuration of the firewall itself. So if you have a loosely configured firewall, the moment you close in that switch and you power on that access path, you're possibly letting unintentional communications come into your system, in and outbound. It doesn't matter which direction. If it's, you know, if it's poorly configured, you could be creating a whole host of problems.
Well, I'd like to say thank you for your time there, but also wanted to provide a little bit more additional resources. So ABS Group, NERC, and Network Perception have been working together to address the potential scope of work that will be required to achieve this type of compliance. And you can reach out to this survey that we created to help give you a budgetary estimate of that implementation. And once you fill out the form, you'll receive an email and a budgetary estimate based on the information you provided. So it's a good tool to help you kind of get started.
And Keon, if I can add that, and depending on how you fill out the survey, we may actually reach out to you, and it could be any one of our groups here that would reach out to you to ask more questions, so we can give you a better indicative budgetary estimate. But we're only as good as the information that's provided, and this is just really a tool to at least give you an idea of what you might be looking at in terms of costs.
Well, I'd like to thank everyone for joining. We appreciate you giving great questions and encouraging the discussion. Please look out on LinkedIn for the part 2 of this series to be coming soon. I'd like to thank our panelists. We have Joseph Baxter from Network Perception. We have Michiko Sell from NERC, and we have Ben Sterling from ABS Group. Thank you, panelists, for joining this discussion today, and we hope to talk to you again soon. And thanks, everyone, for joining.
Thank you.